Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949, in the city of Kobe, Japan. This was just 4 years after the end of World War I and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In short, Japan was in the midst of a severe economic crisis. The country was striving to rebuild its infrastructure and emerge from poverty. However, despite the poverty the people were experiencing, the Sagawa family was in a different position. Issei's father, Akira, was a partner in the Kurita Water Industries Company. His grandfather, meanwhile, was the successful editor of one of Japan's largest newspapers. For this reason, the family did not face financial hardship. They lived in a large house surrounded by nature and farmland. At that time, the best possible conditions a Japanese family could have were ready for Issei. But Issei's arrival into the world was far from easy. He was born prematurely. He was so small that he fit into his father's palm. Doctors feared he might not survive. Moreover, he soon developed enteritis, a disease affecting the small intestine that impairs nutrient absorption. His parents mobilized all their resources to save him. He managed to survive. However, his health remained frail for the rest of his life. Even as an adult, he was short and delicate. He stood only 140 centimeters tall. This physical difference created a deep complex in him from a young age and led him to develop a withdrawn personality. His only refuge was literature. He became passionately devoted to reading, and this habit also helped him in his school life. However, the positive aspects of Issei's life ended there. The rest of his biography was filled with dark and unimaginable events. It all began when Issei felt a perverse attraction in first grade. From that moment on, he felt a strange pull toward people. Issei first noticed this attraction when he saw his friend's leg in first grade. From that moment on, he began to wonder what it would be like to experience different sensations. Another repulsive detail in his biography is that during his youth, he repeatedly engaged in perverted acts with his own dog. It was clear that such perversions were gradually fostering a savagery within his character. In his youth, this unhealthy obsession was limited to fantasies. However, as he grew older, these ideas turned into an obsession, and he was simply waiting for the right time to turn them into reality. When Issei turned 24, he moved from Kobe to Tokyo with his family. There, he enrolled in the literature department of the prestigious Veiko University. Classes came easily to him, but his mind wasn't solely occupied with school. Thanks to Veiko's prestige, the university attracted a large number of international students. This meant Issei had the rare opportunity to see European girls up close, a sight seldom seen in Japan. One day, a tall, blonde girl of German descent caught his attention. He secretly followed her home and discovered that she had rented an apartment in the same building where his own grandmother lived. Since he knew the place well, he thought this was a perfect opportunity. His plan was quite simple: to enter the room at night, end the girl's life, and explore the pleasures he'd been curious about. However, he was so obsessed with this idea that he didn't think through the details, and in the end, he was easily caught. He managed to sneak into the sleeping girl's room, but he accidentally bumped into her with his knee. The girl woke up instantly and screamed. At that moment, Issei panicked. The frightened girl gripped his hands so tightly that Issei couldn't do a thing. He was completely helpless against the physically strong and tall girl. Issei was arrested and charged with attempted assault. While everyone thought Issei was acting like a pervert, the truth was very different. However, his wealthy father, Akira, quickly swept the matter under the rug. He paid the victim to have the charges dropped. At the time, Akira had no idea how terrifying his son's plans were. Perhaps as a father, he wanted to give his son a second chance, or perhaps he simply covered up the incident to protect his business reputation. But this silence gave Issei the freedom to commit even more brutal crimes, and this incident tarnished their family's name forever. In 1977, at the age of 28, Issei moved to France. His goal was to earn a PhD in French literature at the Sorbonne University in Paris. In those years, Paris was already a great dream for Japanese people. But Issei's motivation wasn't just that. He wanted to get closer to European-looking girls. However, his plans were far from romantic. Almost every night, he brought a sex worker home, and each time, after their encounter, he aimed his gun and tried to pull the trigger, but he never had the courage to do it. In 1981, during his final year of the doctoral program, a new student from the Netherlands joined the class. This student was 25-year-old Renee HARTEVELT. She stood out for her beauty and warm demeanor. Renee was one of the few girls who tried to talk to Issei, but her kindness would lead to a catastrophe he never expected. One day, Renee invited a few students over for dinner. Issei was among the guests. For a lonely man, it was an unforgettable moment. Issei saw it as a sign of fate. From that day on, he couldn't get Renee out of his mind. He had feelings for her, but there was a cruel fantasy clouding his mind. Yes, Issei truly wanted to eat her, and unfortunately, this was not a metaphor. Renee, however, had formed a good impression of him. In a letter to her family, she described how the dinner had gone very well and how she had enjoyed their conversation about literature and theater. Over the weeks, a friendship developed between them. They often met for coffee and helped each other with their studies. But at a certain point, Issei couldn't control himself. He decided to turn his obsessive fantasy into reality. He wrote a letter to Renee. He invited her to his home to work on poetry. Renee gladly accepted the invitation. On the evening of June 11th, Renee arrived at Issei's home. She couldn't have imagined what was about to happen. As she sat at the table reading poetry, Issei approached her from behind. He aimed his gun at her head and pulled the trigger. At first, Issei went into shock and fainted. When he came to, he realized what he had done and moved on to the second, even more terrifying part of his plan. Issei first sexually assaulted his victim. He then tried to bite her skin but failed. He then left the house and bought a butcher's knife. When he returned, he committed horrific acts and photographed every step of the process. What remained of the victim's body revealed just how horrific the incident had been. This brutality lasted 2 days. On the third day, the remains of the lifeless body began to decompose biologically. He packed the remains into 2 suitcases. That evening, he took a taxi to the balloon forest. He planned to dispose of the evidence in this park, which he had visited frequently before. Upon arriving at the park, he dragged the suitcases toward the edge of the lake. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for. The park was quite crowded in the evenings, or perhaps this didn't bother him much, because he wasn't in a hurry to finish what he was doing. Issei, exhausted from carrying the suitcases, sat down on a bench and suddenly fell asleep. When he woke up, he noticed an old man opening one of the suitcases from which blood was seeping. The man began screaming at the sight. Issei, however, calmly got up and walked away into the darkness. Though he managed to escape at that moment, many people had seen him. The police quickly gathered a description of him. The taxi driver who had taken Issei gave his home address to the police. The Japanese killer was caught that same day. What surprised the police was that Issei didn't deny any of the charges and confessed immediately. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to have been caught. Now he could share his dark thoughts. A search of his home revealed horrific evidence. Photographs, video recordings, and Renee's belongings, all were at the scene. The refrigerator in the house was filled with the victim's remains. There were still half-eaten pieces left on the plates. The scene was truly disturbing. There was no longer any doubt. Issei had to pay the price for what he had done, but the circumstances did not allow for that to happen. Despite the abundance of evidence and Issei's confession, the legal process was far from straightforward. This was because he was a citizen of another country. While awaiting trial, Issei spent 2 years in custody at La Santé prison in France. His father spent a great deal of money trying to find a good lawyer, but the outcome was completely unexpected. It was determined that Issei was not of sound mind. Therefore, he could not be tried in court, and it was decided that he would be committed indefinitely to a mental hospital in France. While he was there, Japanese writer Inuhiko Yomota visited him for an interview. Yomota later wrote a book titled In the Fog, which focused on Issei's crime, and published it in Japan. The book quickly became popular and caught the attention of the French press. As the story gained widespread attention, the French public grew furious. People were outraged that the taxes they had earned through hard work were being spent on the care of such a man. In the wake of the backlash, French authorities decided to extradite Issei SAGAWA to his home country. However, at this very point, the differences between the 2 countries' legal systems created a major problem. Because the French court had effectively dismissed the murder charges against Issei based on a ruling that he was not of sound mind. As a result, all case documents remained confidential and could not be sent to Japan. Ultimately, the Japanese justice system reached an impasse. It was impossible to press charges without evidence. Issei was admitted to Matsuzawa Mental Hospital in Tokyo and diagnosed with a personality disorder. However, his stay there was short-lived. In subsequent medical examinations, doctors claimed that he did not suffer from any mental illness and that the crime stemmed from fantasies. As of August 12, 1986, Issei Sagawa became a fully free citizen. After his release from the psychiatric hospital, there were no longer any restrictions or limitations on Issei. However, the crime he had committed was known to everyone, and naturally, no employer wanted to hire him. One day, a Japanese newspaper publisher asked Issei to write a piece describing his crime and offered him $20,000 in exchange. Issei realized then that he could profit from his notoriety. Thanks to his literary education, writing came easily to him. So he began writing articles and essays about the murder for various publishing houses. But he didn't stop there. He created disturbing drawings depicting women's portraits, erotic images, and his dark fantasies, and put them up for sale. He even produced several manga, Japanese comic books, detailing, in graphic detail, how he had attacked Renee HARTEVELT, the woman he had killed. Issei was also invited to work as a restaurant critic and wrote restaurant reviews for a Japanese magazine for a long time. His popularity reached such a point that people began to view the murder he committed as if it was something that had never actually happened in real life. He was constantly invited to interviews and television programs. But what was even more shocking was that Issei repeatedly received offers to star in adult films. In fact, the plots of some films were even based on the murder he had committed. Thus, the cannibal killer lived freely, comfortably, and with a substantial income for years. Issei never committed another crime. However, in his interviews, he repeatedly admitted that he still fantasized about his dark fantasies. He even said he wanted to be the victim of a beautiful woman. In the years that followed, he stated that he was no longer attracted to European women, but that the most beautiful women were Japanese women on the island of Okinawa. Strangely enough, despite all these confessions, Japanese society did not view him as a threat. In the wake of his notoriety stemming from his crimes, his family's life was turned upside down. His father was removed from his position as a partner in the company, and all of his new business ventures ended in failure. In 2005, Issei's parents passed away. However, he did not even attend their funerals. All that remained of his family were debts. After paying them off, he began living in a government-provided home and subsisted on a small pension. In 2013, he suffered a stroke. This caused permanent damage to his nervous system. In the remaining years of his life, he became dependent on physical assistance every day. This assistance was provided either by his younger brother or by caregivers, and Issei passed away on November 24, 2022 at the age of 73 in a Tokyo hospital due to complications from pneumonia.